Thank you. And I had the opportunity of speed reading your presentation, and I acknowledge your work to date in relation to it and the very low base indeed from which you're taking things. I acknowledge that. We're here in Biodiversity Week again, making statements about climate change. It's now 5 years after we declared, or 4 years, is it, after we declared a climate emergency and a biodiversity emergency. And you've outlined some of the reports that highlights the crisis that we're in. Now, I represent a city and a rural area, and I'm absolutely in favour of rural and regional development. And in fact, I think we're developing the cities out of proportion. Let me just get that on the record. I represent a rural area and an island area. However, a lot of those areas are operating in a vacuum. I mightn't have time to come back to them. We have no island policy. We haven't taken up the opportunities offered by seaweed and wool, and I've mentioned this repeatedly, which will provide sustainable work in rural and near the sea. In relation to this, you've mentioned some of the reports, this state of biodiversity, more losers than winners. This is the Queen's University Belfast that almost everybody has referred to. 48% of the over 71,000 species included in their analysis are undergoing population declines. The report states that global biodiversity, that is life on Earth, is entering its 6th mass extinction. Now, Deputy Bruton talked earlier about scientists not using clear language. I can't think of any clearer language than life on Earth, global diversity, is entering its 6th mass extinction. This is the first mass extinction directly induced by a single species, we human beings. 28% of life on Earth is currently threatened with extinction. And then the report Ireland's Changing Flora, a 20-year research published in March 2023, non-native plant species now outnumber native ones. Globally, 40% of plant species and so on are threatened, and biomonotony is taken over from biodiversity. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity, 19, it issued a stark warning, and things have deteriorated since then. In 19, it said nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinctions is accelerating with grave impacts on people around the world. And of course, the grave impacts are on people who have less. That's always been the way those most vulnerable suffer. The National Parks and Wildlife 2019 report, 85% of Ireland's EU protected habitats have bad or inadequate status and so on. Birdwatch Ireland, published every 6 years, shows that 63% of Ireland's 211 regularly occurring wild bird species are categorised as red or amber due to moderate. Now, these are all the figures. Another figure that I read out last year, I could read the same speech again. I'm not inclined to read out speeches, but I could read out the same thing. 70% of birds alive are poultry, mostly chickens. That might tell us something. Now, I agree with your two colleagues that were there earlier on, and indeed I'll be rushing off afterwards, but it's indicative that the Dáil is empty in relation to a biodiversity crisis. And we have I have an excerpt from Leo Varadkar's, the Taoiseach speech on the 9th of May on Europe Day. Climate change is the single greatest threat facing humanity. We must be the generation that turns the tide on climate change and biodiversity loss. And we have an empty Dáil, and indeed I'm apologising in advance. I'll be running off after this to catch a bus. But it's symbolic, isn't it? We're here talking to ourselves, really, and you're being left isolated physically and metaphorically in relation to the progress of a crisis, and that's part of the problem. When you acted last year on the National Parks and Wildlife's review, that review pointed out, carried out by Stout and O'Caneja, Commercial Stout and O'Caneja, considerable increase in the national parks since in their responsibilities without matching reserves, lack political champions at all levels, and so on and so on. Then we have after we declared the climate and biodiversity emergency, two things of simple things happened. A Supreme Court judgment said the mitigation plan was vague. That was a plan that was passed, was vague, and the citizen was entitled to know what was in it. It was quashed. More recently, we had the Bord Pleanála agreeing that the outer bypass in Galway, the order granting the permission should be quashed because they had failed to consider climate change. We have the SPRAT, fantastic policy brought in by the government, went to court. 4 years later, no policy on sprat. We have unsustainable catching of sprat in our waters. On one little thing that the Department of Agriculture failed to communicate properly with UK and with Europe. The point being, we have a vacuum. The big boys are going in. Your colleague said that the people are ahead of us, and some other point that I agreed with. They're way ahead of us. They showed us in Galway what to do years ago. How government policy has created the crisis. And the point that Deputy Richard Barrett made in relation to the model that we keep pursuing is absolutely leading us to extinction. And I would disagree with Deputy Bruton in relation, of course we need commercial activity, of course we do, but it must be based on policy and it has to be matched by non-profit development for the sustainability of our planet. We can't keep going on like this. Any of us could stand up here and talk about all of the warnings that we've got. I would like just for the last few seconds to talk on the possibilities. There is no need for this divisive language, them and us, farmers and us. I represent a broad base. There is no need for that. Farmers are part of the solution, but the government is repeatedly failing to deal properly with the threat that we're facing and to reward people and to bring in sustainable policies. I'll mention again in conclusion, seaweed is a glaring example. Wool is another example, none of which have been acted on to date. And we're now going down the road of exploiting, and the word is exploit, our waters, once again, using the exact same model that has led us to the point of no return.